Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. My name is Andy, and for the next 50 minutes, we're going to talk about SharePoint Online, a site building decision tree. Contact information is here on the main slide. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter at Andy Huneycutt. Want to give a big shout out and thanks to all of the amazing people that are putting this event together. This is one amazing community effort. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this this week. This is pretty awesome. I want to thank the SharePoint Conference, now known as the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference, for assisting and helping to put this together. If you've never had a chance to participate in this conference, it's an amazing event. I've been to a few of them myself, and I'm really looking forward to 2021 when we can meet face to face and collaborate and communicate and SharePoint and just network. So I'm really looking forward to next March. Hopefully, the world will start to settle and we'll be able to get back to a little bit of normalcy. So big thanks to the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference for stepping in and helping us out with this event. Also want to make sure that we thank all of the great sponsors for helping us to put on this event. Sponsors really make this happen. They're the ones that kind of keep these events going, whether it's large events, virtual events like we're having here, but also the larger conferences that we participate in, as well as the smaller events like the SharePoint Saturdays or the Office 365 Saturdays or the SQL Saturdays. They're definitely a big help in putting those events together. I know as a community organizer, putting together smaller events, I couldn't do it without them. So a lot of thanks to all of our sponsors for helping us out here this week. So with that, there is a charity associated with this. This is going to support community relief efforts. We've got a slide here set up in the deck for you. Check it out, United Way International Medical Corps. There's a lot of people out there in a lot of need right now. So if you have the opportunity, definitely check out these charities and contribute in any way that you can. So who am I? Well, the schedule says William Huneycutt, but I go by Andy. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm an enterprise collaboration specialist. I work with companies large and small all over the US and even internationally, primarily with my company, Upskill Tech Incorporated, but also with C Prime Learning, formerly ASBE Training. I've been a trainer, consultant, contractor with them for going on 10 years. Upskill is my entity. That's my coaching, collaboration entity. And I work with companies large and small to implement Microsoft 365 technologies. I started off with SharePoint on-prem 2007, and worked all the way up to everything that Microsoft 365 is today, whether it's SharePoint, Teams, the Power Platform, and all the various applications in between. 2017, I was recognized as a Microsoft MVP, really humbled and honored to be a part of that amazing community. Really gives me a way to interact with the product team and the engineers and to really more deeply learn these technologies, but also be able to spread a lot of that knowledge to the entities that I work with. So this topic that I want to talk about today is the SharePoint Online site building decision tree. And this has been something that I've been working on for a couple of years now, because as we migrate into SharePoint Online, it's not the SharePoint that we once knew. Things are significantly different here, and they change a lot quicker, and a lot of newer technologies are being implemented every day. So helping other organizations prepare to migrate to the cloud, prepare to start embracing these technologies has definitely been a challenge. And I wanted to find a way to kind of simplify that a little bit. So what I want to talk about here today is what to expect when it comes to a site provisioning process. It's not a lift and shift whenever you migrate from a previous version of SharePoint into SharePoint Online. You need to unthink what you knew and learn what SharePoint is actually capable of, because if you do just a lift and shift, you're going to miss out on a lot of capabilities. But that leads to all kinds of questions. Well, what kind of sites do I work with? Because there's a lot of different sites and capabilities out there. So I wanted to demystify that a little bit and to provide a little bit of insight into the different sites that are out there, some of the options that you're going to have, but also to give you some real world application from working with a large number of clients on this. Also, you need to be thinking about how you maintain your flexibility moving forward. This platform does introduce new features a lot more rapidly than the previous versions of SharePoint. So what are the things that you can do to maintain some forward flexibility so that you can get the most out of SharePoint today, but also have an eye on the future? So I'm not going to bombard you with a lot of governance. This is going to be a guided kind of conversation where we talk about what we can do with SharePoint Online. So the first thing I want to mention, sites. There are a lot of different sites that we've worked with over the years. For those of you that are coming from SharePoint on-prem, the team site was pretty much king there, but we also worked with things like project sites for project management, synchronizing with Microsoft Project Professional. We might have worked with blog sites, we might have worked with record retention, we might have worked with document centers, we might have even worked with community sites, and even the BI center for creating sites. And in this environment, everything that we created previously, you can migrate that right into SharePoint Online as part of your cloud experience. These sites had options for customization, but a lot of times the customization was really heavy-handed. In many cases, we had to get contractors, developers involved to create custom solutions. At the core, it was about collaboration and content management. So it's about creating a place to essentially manage what users needed to be able to work for their daily activities, and then we extend that through that custom development or through that contract work. And again, these sites do work in SharePoint Online, but when you get into SharePoint Online, you're going to find there are a lot of different sites, and in some cases, Microsoft has simplified some of the site provisioning process and the site templates that we use. But in other cases, they've given you a plethora of options that you might not have considered before. So even though we can work with those classic sites like we have before, if you stick to just those classic sites, you're going to miss out on a lot of the other capabilities in SharePoint Online. So the big question is, what kind of sites do you need? And then how do you start to apply those? Now, if you've never seen this, Microsoft has done a really good job in their documentation, docs.microsoft.com. Got a link here in the PowerPoint for you. But they've done a really good job in their documentation of creating a guide for the modern experience. One of my favorite things is the SharePoint Lookbook. If you've never seen it, quick search for SharePoint Lookbook. It's really cool. It shows you a lot of the capabilities, but how do you get there? So with that, there's some really good articles on docs.microsoft.com, and I recommend starting off with the guide to the modern experience in SharePoint. They've broken it into a few bullet points that I have here on the slide. We're going to go through some of this a little bit more in depth through the presentation here. But the first thing they start off with is your information architecture and something called hub sites. Unthinking your typical site collections, flattening out your architecture, and making things a little bit more future-proof. We're going to come back to that. Things like navigation and branding have been updated significantly in SharePoint Online, but it's also been simplified so that most end users can apply it, so that we don't have to do coded solutions, so that we don't have to have the high maintenance and overhead moving forward. If you want to go that route, there are options for that. There's some really great out-of-the-box options for that. There's some great developer tools, and some of the partners in the Microsoft community do some really excellent stuff, including some of our sponsors here this week. Microsoft has updated some of the publishing options that we have, simplifying some of what we used to use with the SharePoint Server publishing infrastructure. They're giving us some simpler ways to do publishing and approval, tying in tools like Power Automate, running flows that allow us to do approval for like pages and page design. Search, there was a big keynote yesterday by Bill Baer. There's a lot of really cool things happening in search, including the unified search experience that is currently rolled out to SharePoint Online worldwide. I know I've seen it in my tenant, I've seen a couple of my customer tenants already, and it's bringing that search experience, unifying it into one place, but also making search a lot better experience for the end users, focusing in on relevant recent results, bringing the things that you work on most frequently to the forefront. Sharing the permissions. In some cases, the tried and true sharing permission model is the same as it always been, and it hasn't really changed that much. But in other instances, with the introduction of Microsoft 365 groups, some of that permission model has changed a little bit. So we're going to briefly mention that. Performance has been hugely improved. Most end users may not pay attention to that, but being an IT pro, these are things that I tend to notice. So the performance on the back end is significant. There's been some really cool demos, but I notice it every single day. And then support for things like multilingual. These are things you need. They're for those organizations that have facilities all across the globe. There are tools that they're now Microsoft's implementing, that can help us to address those multilingual situations when we need it. So this guide is kind of the bullet point of the starting block for that. Now, getting into the site decision model, let's go to our decision tree. I'm giving you the decision tree here in the first 10 minutes of the presentation, but we're going to come back and revisit this a little bit later in the presentation. So when I go to help someone migrate to the cloud, when I go to help someone maximize their SharePoint Online instance, I want to provide them with the options that they have available. And we do that usually through a series of questions, a little bit of content analysis, playing the SharePoint analyst role, and try to get an understanding for their use case. How are they using SharePoint? What are the bullet points that they need to define? And then what are their goals? What are their pain points? What are the bottlenecks? So identifying that, there's a series of questionnaires that we can go through. There's a series of steps, flowcharts that we can go through. I've kind of identified a couple of basic questions, especially when it comes to setting up the architecture. And this is very similar to what we've seen in previous versions of SharePoint. There's essentially two main layers that we run into. There's the publishing layer, and then there's the collaborative layer. The publishing layer tends to be driven from the top down. This is more of an organizational perspective. So the publishing layer is going to be an authoritative voice for things that represent like the organization as a whole, or major departments, business units, or even divisions within the organization. So we have some tools out there that we can take advantage of in SharePoint Online for that. Things like home sites, communication sites, and even organizational news, even tying it all together with hub sites, which gives us a more flexible model moving forward. Then underneath that publishing layer, we have the collaborative space. And this is where we get a lot of value from SharePoint. It gives our workers a place to centrally manage information, to collaborate, to communicate, and to manage content all in one place. So these collaborative spaces, they're less top-driven, they're more self-service, and in many cases, organizations are taking a light-handed approach. They're allowing self-service site creation because we have significantly more resources available in SharePoint Online versus the content databases that we had in prior years with SharePoint on-premises. So these collaborative spaces are in many cases set up for self-service site creation. Now, users, they're afraid to kind of click on the buttons. They're afraid they're going to break something, but there's not really much that they can break. They can create team sites. They can create Microsoft team-enabled sites. They can create Office 365 group sites. They might be able to create communication sites, but they're creating collaborative spaces, a place to communicate, manage content, and then work together all from that central location, whether it's just for daily business activities, whether it's for short-term or long-term projects and initiatives that they're working on. There are different sites and different templates that are going to be set up for that. So let's dive in to the different types of sites that we have, and we'll revisit this and kind of go through a decision-making process of how to pick some of these sites and how to actually apply them. So we just want to kind of do a guided tour through the different site templates that we work with in SharePoint Online. Now we're going to start off with tried and true. This is the classic team site. This is the team site that you've worked with in SharePoint 2013, 2016, to a certain extent in 2019 as well. If you're migrating into the cloud, this is probably what you're going to get whenever you first get there. So we call this the classic user interface, but that's actually misleading. Because in SharePoint Online, your page may look like this, but as soon as you go to a document library or you go to a list, chances are that's going to have the modern user interface actually applied to it. That was a default setting Microsoft set in April of, I want to say 2019. We used to have the option at the top, at the central admin level, to be able to set classic or to default to the new modern experience as the tenant owner. Microsoft set that or took that feature away a while back, and now you have to manually go back site by site, site collection by site collection, and revert back to lists and libraries in that classic UI if you want. Why? Because Microsoft's not going to be doing any more updating to the classic user interface. What it looks like today is what it's going to look like tomorrow and even a couple of years down the road if you tend to still work with those interfaces. Now, your pages, they're going to work with the wiki or the web part page. Those will stay classic unless you make the decision to actually modernize or update those. We'll talk about some of those options in a moment. But your lists and libraries now default to the modern experience, and then on an individual basis, you can go back and switch that to that classic interface if you want. So that's the first thing you're going to run into. You might have a classic homepage and a modern document library, two different user interfaces that can cause confusion with your end users. Now, beyond the UI or the user interface, these work with the classic hierarchies, top level site in a site collection and then nested subsites underneath it. And even though you can have 500,000 nested subsites in a site collection, the question is really, should you? Because you're talking about nesting information in a structure that has limited flexibility. If a top level site is no longer active and a subsite underneath it is, it's really hard to promote that subsite to a top level site or to get rid of that top level site without impacting the subsite underneath it. Parent-child relationship. Also, you have to run into really complex permissions, working with unique permissions, working with inherited permissions. And anybody who's ever done a lot of work with permissions can tell you in a really large site collection, that's a nightmare. It's not very fun. So you get the classic permission model, you get the classic hierarchies, still supported. You get a great place to share, collaborate, organize, work with content. These sites can represent all kinds of things. They can be big departments, business units, divisions, representing those entities for the organization, but they also serve as collaborative spaces for projects and team collaboration. There's no one-to-one mapping between the classic user interface, especially web parts, and the modern user interface. In fact, some of the classic features, there are modern equivalents that extend or exceed the capabilities of what you had before. And these can do things like be connected to Office 365 groups. They can be associated with hubs, but you're not going to get the full value unless you're working with a fully modern site. So the classic experience is still there. The classic team site, we call this the little t, they're still out there. Now, you will be able to create these from central admin. So creating the site provisioning process that you've had previously, that's still supported even in SharePoint Online. You can create a team site using the classic experience, but you can also create a team site with no Office 365 group. That's a little bit confusing, so we're going to break that down in a slide in just a moment. But if I'm in central admin, or if I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center, I can provision sites just like I always have, selecting templates, and even the classic templates are actually supported there. But I have new modern options that we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So with that, this is a modern team site. It's very similar to the classic team site, except for the whole experience is modernized. The web pages are modernized, the lists and the libraries are modernized. So it has that seamless user interface associated with it. It does everything that the classic site can do. It helps you to create, organize, and share content, gives you that central point for all of that information. It can represent a division, a department, a business unit for that publishing or for that authoritative structure, but it can also represent those collaborative spaces for teams and for project management. Now, the classic permission model is still applies here. So the tried and true permissions that you've worked with, SharePoint groups, permission levels, permissions, and then members of those groups is still going to apply here. You can create hierarchies, so you can have top level sites and you can create subsites underneath there, just like you've always done. But you can also work with flattening it out with hubs and hubifying those sites. These sites can be associated with an Office 365 group so that you can extend the permission model into some other applications in Office 365. So we have the little t in the classic user interface, even though the lists and libraries are modern. Then you have the little t in the modern user interface, and that kind of gives you everything in a modern UI. Now, as you're starting down this path, one of the first hurdles you're going to face is, how do I get to modern? How do I get to this user interface? Well, there's a couple of ways. You could, through your site pages library, just create new site pages. Those are using the modern user interface, and you could just create new site pages moving forward. You can even set a modern page as the home page of your site. That would be the default page whenever people visit your site. You can manually do this. You could have all your information workers go and do that, but there's some other methods that you can take advantage of as well. So there is a modernization walkthrough from the docs.microsoft.com. The team back in Redmond, they've done a lot of work on this, but they've also partnered with the community to do a lot of work on this. So they have 3 big bullet points to identify when you're ready to modernize. So if you want to get everything into that modern UI, step 1, identify and educate your stakeholders. That's going to be the decision makers. That's going to be your IT pros, your site collection owners, your site collection admins. And then you're going to want to get that information out to your end users. From there, you're going to want to analyze your site collections. Don't worry, this is not a manual process. They have a lot of tools available for you to be able to do this. They have a modernization scanner. It's a tool from the Microsoft Patterns and Practices, the PNP team. And that will allow you to run a report on your Office 365 tenant or your SharePoint tenant. And from there, you'll be able to identify where things like classic workflows are being used, where you got info platforms being implemented, where you have sites that are using the classic user interface and so forth. So not only are you going to be able to analyze along with that, but there's some PNP tools that are going to allow you to modernize as well. So you can do this through PowerShell, or you could do this through .NET, but you can run these tools and you would be able to modernize through some scripting. The PowerShell scripting is actually fairly straightforward, and that's going to give you the ability to run a script, modernize things like site pages, find a modern equivalent of a web part in a modern page based off of a classic page. Now, if you've done any custom development, if you're running any custom master pages, if you've run custom scripting on lists and libraries, maybe using like JavaScript, jQuery, and so forth, some of that you're going to have to manually remove and then start your modernization process. So not everything is going to apply in the modernization tools, but many out-of-the-box options can be modernized to that modern experience. All right, so let's continue down the trail just a little bit. I'm going to circle back to some of the scripting tools in just a bit. So next up, let's say we get into SharePoint Online. We decide that we want to go modern. Well, you could just modernize the user interface, but if you do that, you're going to be missing out on some other capabilities that SharePoint Online and Office 365 supports. Feature introduced a few years ago that's really helpful for those groups that need to collaborate together, especially across multiple applications in Office 365. It was introduced as the Office 365 groups. It's now known as Microsoft 365 groups. What a Microsoft 365 group team site enables you to do is to extend your SharePoint site with applications in Office 365 for additional collaboration. So these are going to be sites that are going to be for the producers of content, for the curators of content. These are going to be for the people that are maybe putting together policies and procedures and loading them into an HR site that everybody in the organization can then go and read and work with. So Office 365 group, number one, it can represent all the different entities, whether it's publishing or whether it's collaborative in your SharePoint space, divisions, departments, business units, teams, and even projects. It's a central place, a SharePoint site to share, create, organize, manage content. It has the modern user interface built right into it. So it extends that modern interface though by, it's got the classic SharePoint permission model as well, but it extends that by offering something called Office 365 or Microsoft 365 groups. And what that is a membership service. It's owners and members that can own the team and in turn the site and the content in it, but also members that can contribute to the site and the content in it. So you get SharePoint as a place to manage your content, manage your files, manage your lists, and collaborate together. But it extends that through Office 365 applications like a shared mailbox in Outlook, like a shared calendar in Outlook, a OneNote notebook for collaboration, a planner plan for task management, Microsoft Stream so that you have a channel and a group for storing video within your organization. And in some instances, you even get Microsoft Forms. You might get Yammer. You might even get Microsoft Teams as part of that. So the Microsoft 365 groups kind of sits on top of your SharePoint model, and it extends that site into those other pieces in Office 365, but the core SharePoint permission model still exists. You can give permissions to just the site without granting permissions to the rest of those applications if you need. So you might have a group of people contributing that content and they need all those tools to develop that content, but you might have end users that simply need to visit and consume that content. And through the classic permission model, they can still do that. So you have these two layers of membership and permissions and collaboration and consumption in these sites. So you can quickly extend your SharePoint site into a collaborative space much greater than what you may have had before. Now, a couple of limitations with this. Only the top level of a site collection can be associated with a Microsoft 365 group. So these definitely work better in flat hierarchies, meaning you can't take a sub-site in a site collection and connect it to a Microsoft 365 group. You can only do it with top level sites. All the features that you get with the modern sites are available, but you also get those other Office 365 apps. So you can work across applications and then still get everything back to your SharePoint site. There are web parts that allow you to surface a lot of those apps right on these modern SharePoint pages. You can take a pre-existing SharePoint site and connect that to an Office 365 group. We call that groupifying. You can also make these hubs. We call that hubifying. And as you're going to see in just a moment, we can also extend that even further through something we call teamifying. So speaking of teams, new kid on the block. This is the thing everybody's out there talking about, Microsoft Teams. There are 75 million active daily users in Teams, and that's tripled over the last couple of months alone. Teams is that tool that brings everything about Office 365 together into that one application. So with Teams, you get that collaborative space, you get communication, it's backed up by a SharePoint site, and then you get the other parts of Office 365. But Teams is built around conversation, communication through meetings, audio, video, and then content management as well. Well, every time you create a team, there's a SharePoint site in the back end of it. So you could create a Microsoft team and use that to represent a division, department, business unit, but also those collaborative spaces for teams or projects. In fact, Teams is actually really well suited for teams and projects specifically because it is such a collaboration tool. Create, organize, share content right inside of Teams, but it's all stored in your SharePoint site on the back end. Teams brings that content to the users in a contextual way. When you go to the site that the team is built on top of, you get that modern user interface. You're going to have your Office or your Microsoft 365 group permissions there for extending across those applications in Office 365, but you're going to have the classic model as well. So you could have a Microsoft team sitting on top of a SharePoint site for collaboration and communication, developing and curating content, and then you could have visitors that only have access to the SharePoint site and the content that's inside of there. They're consuming what you're actually building. That is possible. Just like the Microsoft 365 group sites, though, these can only be top-level sites in a site collection, so flat hierarchies are definitely going to be better here. All the modern site features are supported, and almost anything that I do in one of these sites can actually be surfaced through the Microsoft Teams client. I can take a pre-existing SharePoint site and I can groupify it, and then I can teamify it. I have to go in that order though. I have to connect a classic team or a little T site to a Microsoft 365 group first, groupify it, and then I can connect it to a Microsoft team and teamify it. These can also be hub sites as well. Now, just to visualize that permission model and help you really wrap your head around it, the tried and true model is what we see on the left over here, SharePoint site collection. We have your SharePoint groups, you have your permission levels, and then you have your permissions associated with that. You can create your own custom permission levels if you need. You can add and remove users from groups. You can use domain groups to apply permissions. And if you really want to apply worst practices, you can give individuals permissions to the site directly. That model still exists. Everything that we've talked about to this point, that model still exists. But the Microsoft 365 group model, Office 365 group model, still can sit on top of that, and it can extend that capability from just SharePoint groups to your Microsoft 365 group owners and members. And in turn, that applies those permissions to those other objects, other applications in Office 365, like Teams, OneNote, Planner, Stream, Forms, Yammer, shared mailboxes in Outlook, shared calendars in Outlook. You can have the two models sitting side by side. So you can use the Microsoft 365 groups and the Teams for those collaborative efforts, and then for the consumption efforts, you can use the classic permission model. All right, so continuing forward. Now, let's talk a little bit more, moving from the collaborative space, we're moving kind of into the publishing space a little bit here. Communication sites. These were introduced a couple of years ago, and these sites are a great way to represent divisions, departments, business units, the top level of a division. So let's say I'm in healthcare and I have a nursing portal. This could represent my nursing portal. Or let's say I'm in marketing. This could be my marketing site, where I'm publishing news, announcements, and updates. I'm sharing reports with my users. I'm giving status updates, and I'm presenting other information that my organization needs to consume. So I'm presenting information to maybe a large audience, but I have very few people that are actually going to be contributing to that. Communication sites give me that capability. So the communication sites have a modern user interface. It's kind of like the Oslo layout that we used to have in SharePoint. We still have, but not a lot of people actually use it. It removes the left-hand navigation from your site. It adds it along the top of the site. It spreads information out from end to end, and you worry about the content. Microsoft handles a lot of the presentation for you. Big, bold visuals are supported here. News, announcements, and updates are supported here, but it's all about presenting your story in an impactful way to your users. Now, communication sites can only be the top level of a site collection. You can't create a communication site as a sub-site. So it represents those divisions, departments, and business units very, very well. It has the classic permission model built into it. So SharePoint groups, permission levels, and then permissions. You cannot connect it to an Office 365 group. No groupifying here, and you cannot connect it to a Microsoft team. No teamifying here. So you get the classic permission model that you can work with. Now, it does have a sub-site based hierarchy. You can create sub-sites underneath it. You just can't use the communication site template as a sub-site. You can create modern team sites underneath it. You can create little team sites using the classic UI underneath it. All the lists and libraries that you've worked with previously are still going to be supported here, but the web pages are all modern, uses all the modern web parts as well. And lastly, this site can actually be a part of a hub, which we're going to talk more about hubs in just a moment. Hubs give me the ability to flatten out site collections, remove subsites, make everything a top-level site, and then still bring them together. So it can be part of a site collection as long as it's the top level, but it can also be a hubified in a hub association if we need it. But again, great way to share news, announcements, and updates for a large audience, and give you that publishing infrastructure, give you that intranet capability out of the box, and you just concentrate on the content. Microsoft handles a lot of the presentation for you. Now, you can do some really cool things with communication sites. Themes, headers, navigation, footers, all built into it. Themes, you can pick from a predefined theme, but you can also customize your theme with limitations. One of the things that Microsoft's really concentrated on here is making sure that you recognize that you're in SharePoint, that a SharePoint site looks like a SharePoint site, but that you do have some level of customization so that you can make it your own. So you can pick from company themes, you can customize a theme, you can even do SharePoint themes. You can apply custom headers as well. So you can change the header at the top. You can make it standard or compact. You can drop in custom logos. You can even change the background color associated with the header at the top. You can work with navigation. Communication sites have the mega menu. This is something that we've wanted in SharePoint for a number of years. There's some third-party and custom development tools out there that do mega menus. Well, communication sites have mega menus built in. All you have to do is click edit on your site template, and then you can start creating a mega menu right now. Really easy. And then they also support footers. So you can drop footers on the bottom of any communication site. That gives you either a simple or an extended view so that you can present other information. You can put links in, down there if you need to. You can add images. You can add blocks of text if you need to. You can even change the background. So header, footer, themes, as well as mega menus, you get it all, and you get a full drag and drop interface for presenting your story. It's a really great tool to take advantage of. So communication sites are great. They represent those departments, business units, and divisions. But as you start flattening your structure, if you start working with hubs, you start minimizing or eliminating subsites, inevitably, you're going to run into SharePoint root. SharePoint root is your company.sharepoint.com. Every time you install, or whenever you install SharePoint on-prem or you get a SharePoint online instance, there's a root that's already there for you. It's your company.sharepoint.com. And a lot of companies kind of ignore it. They go and create other structures. They don't really pay attention to it. But inevitably, somebody types in that URL, and that takes you to a classic site collection. And we can actually take advantage of that root. Now, some companies are actually using that. That's their corporate intranet. And it's a really great way to build a corporate intranet. In the last couple of years, though, we've gotten a couple of tools that allow us to actually modernize that root site and then to extend its capabilities so that we get a great corporate intranet without a whole lot of custom development. So we can build home sites. A home site is a communication site that we set for the company or the SharePoint root. It gives us that modern communication site. It gives us this thing called a vertical on the right-hand side, and that can be customized to target information to an audience. So if any user that visits that site sees personalized information, while on the left-hand side, we're still pushing the company story overall. This division, department, or a business unit. The purpose of this type of site, though, is for news, announcements, updates, and statuses. It's built on top of the communication site, so that means it uses the classic SharePoint permission model, no Microsoft 365 groups, no Microsoft Teams associated with it. It has the modern user interface. You worry about the content, they'll handle the presentation for you. It can have subsites underneath it, but it works really well with hubs. You could make this the center hub and then hubify your other departments into it if you need to. And it has all the features that a modern team site actually supports. Lists, libraries, modern site pages, they're all there. But this means that I have to replace the predefined root that's already there. So how do I go about doing that? How do I take that root that's already there and give it this modern communication site and build that out? Well, there's a couple of ways to do that. I'm going to show you in a slide in just a moment. This just represents what a root home site can actually look like. It's the top level of your SharePoint intranet. It's that authoritative source for news, events, and communications that your users need. And then some cases you can personalize the content being shown up there through some audience targeting and some personalized websites. Now, it can be the center hub, but it cannot be associated with a hub. So we'll break that down in on next couple of slides. So replacing the root, how do you do it? Well, if you have access to the SharePoint Admin Center, it's pretty straightforward. Find your current root and then select replace site. That's going to archive your current root, and then it's going to bring in that that new communication site that you've already built and use that as the root. Microsoft's actually going to do all of the site URLs and redirect links for you. And so it's really simple in the SharePoint Admin Center to swap this out, but that's not the only way that we can do this. You have options through PowerShell. We can enable communication sites on an existing site. Now, this is something that is currently postponed. This was announced. This is public information. This was announced, but it's currently postponed. When this feature gets released, you can take that current root that you have, run this script from this page, and it would actually replace that site with a modern communication site, which could then be set as a home site. So keep your eyes on the message center. The team, the back in Redmond, they'll make an announcement around this a little bit later on when this feature is ready to roll out. It's on the roadmap as well, but it's been announced. It's something that's very much in the works, and you can take what you already have, turn it to a comm site, and then roll it out. All right, next up. There are some commandlets out there that are associated with this. Whenever you get ready to run this, you're going to want to have an understanding of the commandlets, because you're going to do this through PowerShell. If you've ever turned on the classic publishing infrastructure feature, that is something that will disable this command from running. Most of these root sites don't have that enabled anyways, unless you built on top of it, and then it's something you've manually managed. But when this runs, it will swap out that root for a modern comm site. All right, the other thing that you can do is you can build a communication site however you want, and then you can run a site swap. So that's a script that you can run through PowerShell, and it'll take your current root and swap it out for the new root. It'll archive the current root, so it's in the it doesn't delete it permanently, but it'll also create redirects, and when anybody goes to company.sharepoint.com, bam, takes them right to that new comm site that you designate. So this is an option that's live today. You can go and do your site swap. You just have to have the SharePoint management shell in PowerShell. You have to have admin rights to do this. So if you've got access to your central admin, you should be able to do a site swap, swap in a comm site that you build, and replace the root with that. So that's something you can do right now. All right, so home sites are a great way to provide that authoritative company intranet, but a couple other sites that you need to be aware of. Organizational news. Now, news in SharePoint is a feature through web parts, and it's been in SharePoint for a few years now, and it's actually kind of an update on announcements, or the announcements list. I was a big fan of the announcements list in previous years in SharePoint. I could put an announcements list in a site, drop it as a web part on the homepage of the site, and I could publish updates, news, and announcements to anybody that actually visits that site. And if I were to attach like alerts or a workflow to it, I could push that out to those users. But for the most part, I was driving users to the site to get the most recent information. And that doesn't always work, because not everybody works in SharePoint every single day as much as we want them to. So with the introduction of the news feature in SharePoint, you could create a news article using a site page, publish it as a news article, and you could actually promote that story in a number of different ways. I was having a conversation with my friend Mark Cashman a few years ago, and I was like, you know, it'd be really cool if I could create an authoritative news source in my organization where I could publish news announcements and updates and have it go everywhere. And Mark's like, oh yes, we have that there. It's called the organizational news. You can designate many different sites in your tenant to have an authoritative news publishing feed. These have color blocks that indicate that these are from the organizational news. They sit side by side with the local news, whether it's hub site news or whether it's team site news that you're working on, and they can be consumed in a whole bunch of different places. So for example, there's 6 different places that you can get news today. SharePoint Home, that's SharePoint in the sweet bar at the top. Team sites on the news web part on the home page. Communication sites on the news web part. Hub sites on the news web part. The mobile app supports news, and then Microsoft Teams, you can surface news through channels and tabs. So when you create a news article, you can push that out and publish it in 6 different locations automatically. Your hub sites can actually consume news and publish news out, and then you can bring it to Teams and you can bring that news to your users. So news is a great feature for news announcements and updates, but you can set a site as that authoritative news source, and then you can publish those news announcements side by side with local news and announcements. You just get that color block that indicates that this is a news site, and all you have to do is run a little bit of PowerShell to actually do that. So organizational news, if you've never taken advantage of it, it's really awesome. These are the scripts that you have to run in PowerShell in order to do it. You need to have admin access, but you can mark 1 or more sites as a news organizational site. So your marketing team can have a site, your communication teams can have a site, and they can publish news there and reach everybody that they need. And they can even publish this to your root or your home site as well. So really cool stuff. All right, last couple of things, hub sites. So we mentioned flattening a number of times. What is flattening? That means eliminating subsites, promoting subsites to their own top level site, i.e. making them their own site collection. So when you do that, you lose the association of that nested structure that you had before. So you got the root that represents like that department, business unit, or division, and then the subsites underneath that represent those collaborative spaces or those subdivisions. So when you break those sites apart and you flatten everything out, there's no association from one site collection to another. Well, hub sites address that. Hubs allow me to create a central spoke that represents that major department, business unit, or division, and then bring in the affiliated sites with that. The great thing about hubs is that it's a very flexible model for reorganizing down the road. You get cross-site navigation. There's hub navigation built right into the sites along the top, above the top link bar. You get content roll-up. There's a push and pull of content here, news and other content here, really, really powerful, and it's across site collections. You can apply a theme, so you have a consistent look and feel, logos and navigation, and then search. Search can be scoped to the hub, or it can be broadened if you actually need that, which is really powerful. But with hubs, you get the ability to associate with a hub and then reassociate with other hubs as your business changes. If you've ever tried this with a traditional site collection, it's really hard. You need migration tools. You need to move content and migrate content around. With hubs, you simply choose from a drop-down menu and you can change hub association, and then everything we just mentioned, navigation, themes, logos, search scope, and content roll-up automatically can change and actually apply. So hubs are the new way of organizing, but giving you that flexible model moving forward. So think about your traditional model. You've got a traditional site collection that represents HR. You've got subsites underneath that. You may be inheriting permissions. You may be creating unique permissions in there. If you activate site collection features, it can apply to every site in there, whether they actually need it or not. So what hubs do is to give each of these sites their own site collection, so they get their own permissions, so that they get their own site settings, site collection features, and then we have the ability to reorganize later. And that site in the center may be a communication site, maybe a team site, maybe an Office 365 group site, or a Microsoft 365 group site, or a Microsoft Teams site. That's the center spoke of that Ferris wheel, if you will. So now that we've gone through that whole scenario, now you have all the information you need to start thinking about building out sites for these users that you have coming up. So as you start going through the process, you're going to ask questions like, is this going to be something that represents the organization? Is this going to be something that represents a major department, business unit, or division? Or is this going to be something more based on a collaborative space? Based off of that, let's say it represents something for the organization. If it's going to be intranet-based, you could do a communication site. You could do a home site and swap out that route and use that. Or you could create many different communication sites that represent your big business entities, and then you could hubify and bring in the other sites that you need. This could also apply to your organizational news. But if it's not going to be something that represents big business units, divisions, or departments, it might be something for collaborative spaces. So collaborative spaces, you could turn on self-service site creation, and users create their own team sites. They could create their own Microsoft 365 group sites. They could create their own Microsoft Teams based sites, and then you as the admin can hubify as needed, and you could re-associate through the hubs, or you could do a hub approval process. You could even set owners that are authoritative to be able to make those decisions. So not every site is going to be the same here. Hopefully now you've got the information though that you need to start building out this decision tree so that you can start building out an information architecture that's going to be flexible for you, that's going to give your users what they need when they need it, provide light governance as needed, and maybe even turn on self-service site creation. I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I hope you found this session to be helpful. Really do appreciate you being here. If you have any feedback, would definitely love to hear that, whether it's my performance here today or whether it's the event as a whole. Once again, I do want to thank all of the sponsors for putting this together. I specifically want to thank the organizers of the conference and the team that they have behind this for putting everything together today. We couldn't do it without them. And a big shout out to the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference for helping us out with this here today. Lastly, great raffle out there. There's a bit.ly link here for it. They're giving away a Oculus Quest. Definitely enter in the raffle for that. I wish you luck. And with that, thank you for your time. If there are any questions, I'm going to do a Q&A.
Yeah, there are some questions. Thank you very much, Andy. That was very interesting, very thoughtful. There are some questions in the Q&A, so if you want to hang around and do that.
First one I see, how to flatten a SharePoint 2019 modern site. Unfortunately, SharePoint 2019 on premises, there are no hub sites there. Hub sites are exclusive to SharePoint Online right now, so you can't do any hubifying in SharePoint 2019. I'm on SharePoint 2013. I have a site collection where the top level site has lists for requested forms. If we migrate to a modern communication site, is it better to create these type of lists on separate sites instead of the communication site? It kind of depends. You could still do it on the communication site if it represents maybe that department, division, business unit that you're currently using for that. It just depends on whether that's a site dedicated toward consumption or collaboration. If those forms are more for collaborative purposes, it might be better in a team site. But what you're telling me here, it's a top level site, you got request forms. It sounds like that's a little bit more authoritative, so it might be good to put those in a communication site. Have you set up flows for news yet? I've tested it. Works really, really well. I'm on a first release kind of internal tenant, so I've tested that out. It's been really well. Moving from 2010 to SharePoint Online. Once my list and libraries are migrated, how are they displayed? It's going to be the modern user interface. Your content will be there, but it will be modern user interface with the exception of a couple of lists. The calendar and the task list are going to default back to that classic user interface. That's going to look way different though than what you have in 2010. 2010 and 2013 had a UI update as well. So it's going to be a big jump there. One of the things that you're going to want to do moving from 2010 to SharePoint Online is you're also going to want to take a look at the difference between SharePoint list Microsoft list, which was just announced last week, and then Office 365 applications. For instance, whether to use a task list in SharePoint or to use maybe Planner as part of Office 365. And yes, check-in, check-out is still available in SharePoint Online. Can groups be based on rules within an organization, role and leader? There are some group provisioning policies that you can enable in your admin center. I think there were a couple other talks here this week that actually covered that a little bit more in depth than I can do in a Q&A. But yeah, you can have groups provisioned based off of roles. There are policies you can apply to group creation. Do you feel making a hub site, or excuse me, do you feel making a home site a hub site limits the flexibility since we can't nest hubs? I'm struggling with whether to make the major divisions as hub and then hubify team sites. So I do want to mention Microsoft announced at Ignite in 2019 that you're going to be able to hub a hub. So you're going to be able to create hubs and then bring those to a central hub. They announced that it hasn't been released yet. It's, I think, still in the works. I'd keep my eyes peeled for that. In the meantime, I would create your hubs around your current business units, major divisions. Go ahead and create those, create your home site, and then you can manually add in navigation to the home site that references the other hubs. And then if they allow us to hub a hub later, you can bring it all together through that hub. But build your hubs now. Don't wait on the feature. Tie it together through navigation.
Thank you, Andy.
My pleasure. I'm going to stick around in the chat window for a few more minutes just in case any others pop up. Yep. I know we got to get the next speaker on. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.